Good afternoon and welcome to New America and the first event that the Media Policy Initiative is running. We are very pleased to have here Jessica Clark and Tracy Van Slyke, who will be talking about their new book, Beyond the Echo Chamber. Jessica, on my right here, is a writer, editor and researcher, significant experience across all types of commercial, educational, independent and public media, and is currently the research director of American University's Center for Social Media, where she directs the Future of Media project. Tracy is a journalist to my left, a communications professional and media producer, and currently the director of the Media Consortium, which is a network of, in her words, I'll use the nation's leading independent progressive media outlets. Its mission is to amplify independent media's voice and increase its collective clout. In 2009, Tracy commissioned and edited a report called The Big Thaw, charting a new course for journalism, and in parallel, Jessica worked on and led a report called Public Media 2.0, Dynamic Engaged Publics. We are thrilled that they're here to talk about their project of 2010, and I will be handing over to them in a few minutes. For the record, this and those in the audience, this is live, a webcast, and everything is on the record and stored for posterity on the internet. By way of introduction, we all, I think, know how media is changing in society today and in the US. Much has been written and talked, much talk has been had around the collapse of traditional mainstream newspapers, and not as much as documented some of the exciting and positive events going on in media that is less perhaps objective, but possibly more engaged. And I'll hand over now to Jessica and Tracy to talk about their book and move off to the side where I will moderate questions in a minute. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
So, due to the snowpocalypse, we are doing this live web. So, please feel free to tweet us questions at Beyond Echo, hashtag Beyond Echo, and what's the other one?
MPINAF, which stands for Media Policy Initiative. And I'm happy to announce I'm a new fellow for the Media Policy Initiative, so
All right.
very doubly excited to be here.
Go for it.
I'm having my own throat apocalypse, so excuse me if I'm a little hoarse. So Tracy and I have been working on this book, which you should purchase at your local independent bookstore, Beyond the Echo Chamber, Reshaping Politics Through Network Progressive Media, for nearly 5 years now. And we started when we were both working at In These Times magazine, which is a Chicago-based independent progressive magazine. And what we were wondering, and we were not the only ones, it turns out, is why conservative voices were dominating the media landscape and why all of our progressive friends and allies were not being heard. This was in the context of the first Bush administration, and we really saw there was a lot of potential, there was a lot of organizing, but it wasn't having an impact yet. So at the same time, traditional journalism was undergoing its own sea change. Newspapers, broadcasters, all of what we call legacy outlets were really struggling to figure out what it meant, not just online news, but to have social media emerging. And part of this change, a really significant part for us, was that the media ecology was being radically democratized. Many more voices were coming into the equation. Many more platforms allowed people to distribute and make their own media. So we decided, well, in order to try to figure out what was going on, we needed a map. We needed to be able to visualize the competing systems and how they fit into the larger news ecosystem. And a lot of research had been done on the conservative media landscape, most particularly at that moment in 2004, The Republican Noise Machine by David Brock, who some of you may have heard of. So what we extrapolated from his analysis and the analyses of others is that a lot of money had been put into creating not just media, but ideas, talking points, kind of coordination on the conservative side. And it was well organized, it was well funded, there was a message machine, it was vertical, and it was working. You can see at the end the talking points are being dumped into the mainstream media, and that's kind of what we mean when we talk about the echo chamber. In contrast, the progressive media network was not so organized, not so well funded, not so effective. A lot of money was going into documentary film, especially film slated for broadcast, because documentary film is very expensive and issue-based productions are more attractive to foundations. But there were a lot of gaps. The people on the grassroots were not talking to the people in the Beltway. It was kind of a chaotic communication system. Progressives didn't really want to all be using talking points, so something needed to happen. And then, over the course of all of this organization, there was a big switch. And the big switch was really the shift from top-down broadcast media to networked, decentralized communication. So in 2006, just a year later, we started to see real changes in the media landscape. There was more funding at the top for what we termed message shapers, media liaisons, media watchdogs, organizations that conservatives had funded extensively from the 60s on. And but there was also a very interesting development that we were struggling to define, which is over here on the left. You can see there's kind of an interrelationship between the progressive base and the activist audience. There were these new, you see the green arrows, these new kind of channels of communication happening between traditional media makers and newsmakers and the grassroots and what came to be known eventually as the netroots.
Also, you should notice that there's a lot more connections between different kinds of organizations starting to work together, which we hadn't seen before, where there was a lot of siloing out of media organizations, and now they're starting to work together. Plus, it's in color.
And 3D.
And this was in 2006, so this was only a year later, and that was sort of the year transformation a year later.
Still me?
Yeah.
All right. So from 06 to 08, we saw even more rapid transitions, more new platforms. YouTube became very influential during this period. Social networks, Facebook, MySpace, we all know this story by now, but at the time it was a new world. Mobile, more and more smartphones started emerging, and people started to learn how to use SMS in ways that were non-traditional and interesting. And as Time magazine told us, you became very important in the media equation. So by around 2008, we see this entire constellation of social media platforms with connections springing up across them for people to not just communicate with one another in their networks, but to share media, and to both the media that they had made and the media that progressive outlets were making. And so because of this, there was a new legitimacy and influence that smaller outlets and citizen journalists could have. So this is actually a visualization of, during the 2008 presidential campaign, different kind of hubs in the various media and communication spheres. On the left, you can see Huffington Post, Daily Coast. These have become sort of brand names now. In the middle, the yellow dots are kind of the mainstream, objective, traditional outlets, and on the right you see some of the conservative hubs. And so there's a leveling out, not necessarily in terms of money flowing to those organizations or even eyeballs, but just in terms of the fact that they're all available, they're talking across spheres to one another, they're more visible.
So the question is how do we start taking advantage for the future of journalism of sort of these new tools and these new strategies? And in the book, we really start to lay out what we call our 4 layers of networks. We really need to think as journalists, as media producers and media makers, how we work in a network-powered media system. And so we lay out these 4 layers and what this means for media makers in terms of making impact, reaching new audiences, and engaging audiences. So I'm going to take you through those right now. Okay, so the first one is called networked users. So networked users are people like you and me who like to share information, news, videos through a lot of different social media platforms or mobile platforms, and we generally share it with people that we know are concerned about the same issue or passionate about the same issue. And so media makers really must learn to work with users who are connectors, to help them, to have the users help amplify their content, act as sort of ambassadors for that media organization. And so media organizations or media makers need to ask themselves, how does your project attract and interact with networked users? So it's not just a one-way communication system anymore, as many have been talking about. It's how do you actually start interacting with your networks and actually help start your users and having them be part of the journalism process and potentially distributing your content. Next up is the self-organized networks. And so these networks are actually made up of networked users. So it's me, Jessica, and Tom who came together online, Facebook or Twitter, concerned about the future of journalism, and we've formed a group, whether it's for an hour, a week, or a year, around the same issue. And there's these kind of networks popping up online all the time around a lot of different political issues, a lot of different social and cultural issues. So the question is, how do media makers actually start tapping into those self-forming groups? How do they actually start working with them to get content to those networks? And how do they actually, once again, work with those networks to engage them in helping potentially produce content or figure out what's a budding issue that the media maker needs to cover? There's a lot of opportunities with self-organized networks. Next are institutional networks. So these are networks like nonprofits, advocacy groups, campaigns that have sort of institutionalized communities. They have their e-newsletter subscribers, they have their Twitter followers. These networks are generally more durable, so they'll be more longer lasting. But there's a real opportunities for media makers to start working with institutional networks to actually start driving that content to those networks, to those users. And once again, actually figuring out how to work with those users to produce content, distribute content, and then from there become part of their own network, part of the media makers network. So you're looking at really expanding audience, which drives to future business opportunities, which we can get into in the Q&A if people are interested. And last but not least is our networks of institutions. This part one, we have sort of two-parter on this one, is our media networks. And this is where media makers can come together to collaborate. We're seeing this as a big step forward in the future of journalism, where before we had a lot of organizations that would work in silos, and now they are working together to do a lot of different editorial collaboration, sharing back-end resources, figuring out new business models, new experimental models in the social networking world. So this is really critical for media makers to start figuring out how they can start working together, because this is an opportunity to amplify content and sort of figure out long-term sustainability for journalism. And next is the hybrid model. And the hybrid model is where it's actually bringing sort of the advocacy groups and the media makers together. There's real opportunities for, once again, on multiple levels, for media makers to start working with institutional networks to sort of cross-pollinate each other's audiences, work together to produce content or at least distribute content. And we're really, talking about how do you strategically interact with your users to drive or support content, important journalism that's going to make an impact. So we're going to get into details right here.
It's worth noting that these models don't just stand for progressive media processes. We're seeing engagement be a really central issue on the commercial side in terms of getting subscribers, finding new ways to support journalism outlets. On the public media side is ways to think about how to really engage publics around important issues and around community concerns. So what we've done with this cycle of engagement graphic is we've sort of taken a look at the entire production cycle and how media makers can incorporate users and networks at each phase. So I won't go through the whole thing, but I'll just read the top level headers for people who can't really see it. you can involve your users at the stage of conceptualization of a story or a movie or a piece, content creation, aggregation of related links and sources, amplification, redistributing, sharing on Dig, things like that. Mobilization, bringing people together to act on an issue, to go vote, to call for a landfill to be cleaned up, whatever the issue is. Impact assessment. This is something we're focusing a lot on in the coming months. Getting the stories of use from your users, trying to find out what kind of a difference your media is making. And then impact assessment leads right into fundraising, which hopefully, if you're doing it right, leads right back into conceptualization of the next project. Given the cycle of engagement, that means that there are new ways to think about media impact. Traditional journalism has some qualms about thinking about media impact because objectivity means that you don't necessarily want your users to do something with the information. But our argument is that actually, you're trying to inform them. That's a form of engagement. And there are other ways to think about engagement as well. Not just reach, not just the fact that you've gotten their money or that they've seen your product, but really mission-driven outcomes. So if your goal is to tell people more about environmentalism, go out and find out if they did something, if they bought the new light bulbs, whatever it is. We've identified in the book some new dimensions of impact. Buzz, which is very important online, is very visible. What we're calling credibility, but also whether people think you have authority, they find you authentic. Influence, have you made them do something? Have you reached influencers and changed the conversation? And then engagement, like we saw in the last slide. So really all of this is considered in the context of your media strategy as opposed to there being some universal metric that everybody can measure themselves against.
So we have, in the book, we lay out 6 strategies for impact, and this is really building on, so the network layers, which we just went over, is really sort of the grid work of what the future infrastructure of media making and journalism will look like. These 6 strategies are sort of how do you start navigating that grid. So we're going to go through sort of 3 of those strategies that can be applicable to all kinds of media makers and journalists. The first is build network-powered media, and that goes back to sort of the networks of institutions, where we really want organizations, media makers, to start figuring out how can they work together, both in informal ways or formal. We see a lot of informal stuff sort of in the rise of the net roots. And a more formal way is the organization I run called the Media Consortium, which has a lot of different organizations, media organizations working together on a lot of editorial projects, a lot of audience development projects, branding, business models, and so forth. So that's an example of that.
Embrace 21st century muckraking. In the book, this is we focus on Talking Points Memo, which is a really interesting example because it shows the evolution from sort of a single producer blog all the way up to what has become a very respected and award-winning native online journalism organization. So Josh Marshall, who's the editor, actually came out of progressive journalism. He had worked at the American Prospect and a few other places. Around 2000, he got kind of angry because the election was contested, and he started a blog. He started to get followers, but he was freelancing. He couldn't really make it on his own. But by 2004, he had gathered enough readers to actually branch out, just do TPM, and hire some reporters and some staff. So that's a sort of an interesting business model note. TPM is a very useful case study because it has it demonstrates how you can engage your users to help you do your investigation, how you can build on the larger news ecosystem to aggregate stories about a particular issue in order to follow it over time, and how to really make an impact by focusing on a piece of underreported or an underreported issue or piece of news. So we take a look at the role of TPM in unmasking the Attorney General scandal. There were 8 Attorney Generals fired around the country during the Bush administration, and it was revealed eventually through dogged, enterprising research that they were fired for political reasons. And TPM was really carrying the story. It eventually got picked up by mainstream media. Eventually, Some people were called to the carpet, and Attorney General Alberto Gonzales was called upon to resign. So there's an example of how you can make impact with media. Josh calls his model open source muckraking, and we think it's really worth taking another look at for traditional journalism.
So, I mean, just to reiterate, TPM is a model of actively engaging users on a regular basis, and because of that, and Josh and his reporters credit this model to actually driving a story into the mainstream that traditional journalists were ignoring, and actually changing conversation and the outcome of some major stuff within the Bush administration. And last but not least is our favorite, which is called Move Beyond Pale, Male, and Stale. Does anyone want to take a crack at that one, defining it? No. So I'll try. What we're seeing a lot within a lot of different kind of media organizations, no matter what sector you're in, is that the organization is generally either being run by older white men, or the audience is older white men. And we have nothing necessarily against them, but that's actually not reflecting what the changing demographics of this country is in terms of communities of color, women, and youth, which are the future audiences for media consumption. And we really need to think about how to work with them. In the book, we talk about, for example, around sort of the Jenna 6 trial, where 6 black youth were put on trial for murder, around the rise of the black blogosphere, and how the black blogosphere and sort of the subgenre called the Afrosphere really helped working together, sort of made a mark in terms of coming together, reporting, talking about the story, and getting their networks of different kinds of communities out to write petitions, send money in, and generally the black blogosphere was really ignored before this point in terms of having influence, but they really they made the mainstream media pay attention to them, which then sort of changed the entire conversation around what was happening down in Jenna. We also see a really strong rise in the feminist blogosphere. And, for example, we talk about a great blog called Feministing. There's a lot of other ones. But we talk about this because there's a big byline gap that still happens in a lot of independent media, where we're seeing, if you look at a lot of bylines in a newspaper and a magazine, you're still seeing, over half, 3/4, you're seeing men, and generally white men. And once again, that's not smart for reaching new audiences and new communities, and it's certainly not going to be helpful for your long-term business model. So that's something,
especially in hard news and on the editorial pages.
Yeah.
So what's next?
Go for it.
We think that journalists need to, progressive, whoever, conservative even, foster relationships with diverse media makers, invest in creating tools for assessing impact, like we discussed. There's some even more innovation that we're all going to be plunged into in the next couple of years, moving into the cloud computing, more and more smart apps, smartphone apps, more and more SMS communication, socially responsible gaming. And so journalists need to go back to school. No, not really. Journalists need to go online, learn to innovate, how to collaborate, and how to engage their users.
So that's it from us on that level. Are we doing Q&A?
Okay, yeah.
All right, let's do a Q&A.
To learn more and to buy the book, please visit us at beyondtheecho.net.
Thank you, Jessica.
That slideshow will be up on theecho.net at some point very soon.
We will be responding to questions from the audience and also online on Twitter, #MPINAF or #BeyondEcho. If you're in the audience here, please raise your hand and James will bring the microphone.
Which we didn't expect an audience because
we cancelled the event because of the snow. So we expect most of the questions to come from the online Twitter users. And I'll start with a question here to both of you. You've told a positive story. You've told a story of some successes. And I think I have to ask the critical question here. You hypothesize it's more democratic and it's pretty good for democracy. And I think by bringing new voices in, you make that claim. But really, I've got a further question to you. Isn't this just a different digital elite? And if these voices and engagement are through a sort of are tainted by voices that are tainted by politics, really, are we losing some good journalism here?
Go for it first.
I think it isn't. There's still a digital elite. There's definitely still, there's a digital divide. People who are working, who have families, they don't necessarily have time to get online and make these arguments and do this activism. Although I would argue, there are more voices in the conversation. The possible ideological spectrum of debate has been widened. People who have some expertise are able to insert that into the conversation in new ways. So it's wider. It's just not wide enough. In terms of the question of partisanship, I would argue that some of what are considered mainstream news outlets now are explicitly partisan, not admitting it. That transparency is an important value to explore as we enter, a more open communication system, and that it's still possible to have fact-check, rigorous journalism that chooses to investigate particular topics because of a political stance.
Yeah, a couple of things. A lot of people try and say, well, the internet's sort of killing democracy because people are only reading what they want to read or only accessing the news that they want to access, those perspectives. Well, first of all, before the internet, people were reading what they wanted to read anyways, those newspapers, those perspectives. So what we're actually seeing is that the internet is creating a much more opportunity for finding new kind of diverse voices and maybe perspectives that you don't necessarily agree with. At the same time, there is a digital elite, but we are seeing more and more, once again, as the demographics of this country change, so is who's online. We're also seeing a rise in mobile and how different communities are accessing information through cell phones. And that's something that journalism organizations, media makers really need to think about in terms of what kind of audiences do they want to reach and engage. And it might not be through a newspaper, a magazine, or your computer screen anymore. In the future, it could be through mobile in different sorts of ways. And just to reiterate, the idea of transparency, we may dive into this a little bit more, is becoming one of the major ways that we sort of define what is impact. Because transparency is about a journalist being transparent about their own expertise, and if they've been working a beat for a very long time and they know something. So, for example, a lot of times examples that are used are, okay, there's something being written about the environment, right? And then the reporters are made to feel like, okay, we got to give both the climate deniers as much room as sort of the people that proven that there's a big climate change happening, when actually the reporter knows that stuff has been debunked over and over again. So in the name of objectivity, they have to give the same space when they know that's actually not the correct thing that needs to happen, and that's not informing their readers in the right way. So transparency is about sort of letting the reporter share that expertise or their own personal opinion about something at certain points, and being clear with that with the users that they have, at the same time being held accountable by their users, interacting with them, having a conversation with them about that transparency or about that opinion, because it doesn't just stop in that one-way communication anymore. It's about the multi-pronged dialogue.
I'd say one more opportunity has arisen in this environment, which is that there's a lot more fact-checking happening in a transparent fashion. So this doesn't just empower people who want to spout off or have an axe to grind. It also empowers universities and other organizations to try to hold loud voices accountable and check claims out.
Okay, cool. There's a question from Matt Wood on Twitter, and I'll build off that as another question. He asks, is this media inherently progressive? And I noticed the article in the Washington Post from February 1st arguing that the new media is helping conservatives get their anti-Obama message out. You, as I said, you've talked about a success in this book on the progressive left, for the progressive left. What do you think today's political context will yield for this sort of media making?
Well, there's been kind of an arms race happening on every new platform that's come out. We saw conservatives really excel on talk radio. Progressives have had a little bit of a leg up. There's very theories why in these new media outlets. One of the reasons we think that they have taken to these technologies a bit more is because of that sort of distaste for the top-down communication model that conservatives had been using to dominate cable and radio. I think that we're going to see everybody and their mother on the internet during the midterms trying to influence the debate. And the question is going to be, what are the filters that are coming into play to allow people to navigate those discussions? Tracy?
So the book really does talk about sort of what the progressive media has done, although I do think there are lessons that can be learned for a lot of different kind of media organizations over the last couple of years, and sort of what that sets up for the future. I think the progressives really launched a lot and sort of moved forward a lot in the last couple of years is because they were the oppositional party. And now we see that conservatives are the oppositional party, and let's make no mistake that conservatives still do dominate the airwaves. Whether you're conservative or not, celebrate that or not be happy with it, but it's the truth. But they are all also, they were sort of slow in catching up to what the progressive media had been doing, and they're now dangerously, if you're a progressive, really tapping into networks of users, really even engaging sort of the network layers that we talked about in a very strategic way. And I think on the progressive side, we've seen as sort of becoming the power, if you will, that there's been a little less coalescing, and so we need to get back to the relationships that were built, both online and offline, to really start strengthening and working together in different ways again.
I think there's also a complementary movement happening, which is really interesting to watch, which is the push for transparency in government. So it's neither right nor left. It's just a question of how to use network layers and new technologies to make a lot more information that's open source and potentially politically relevant available both to reporters and to the public. So I think that's worth watching in this cycle.
Great. And I have a question to the audience here. Please.
Well, this is actually from Twitter. Someone from the Pulitzer Center had an excellently phrased question. In the world of fast online media, is there a place for slow media, i.e. consuming long-form, comprehensive news?
I sure hope so. Yes. But I think, yes, there is. But I do think a couple of things. One is it's also the package that the long-form journalism comes into. So, for example, you might find in the future that there's a smaller number of people that want to are going to immediately be drawn to this long piece, right, online. But you sometimes need to sort of make different components, potentially a video, a shorter piece, something that starts drawing people in to the story through different platforms, through different ways to access content, different ways that they like consuming content that then can bring them to that longer form journalism. And I would again go back to the Beyond Stale part of the Beyond Pale Mountain Stale and really think about, there's a lot of serious issues out there, and I'm not saying that we don't treat them seriously, but also what are different ways can you communicate that information that might not always make people very tired.
Yeah, there's kind of a cliche running around in the journalism conferences, which is that journalism is not in crisis. Journalism business models are in crisis. I'd say both are in crisis. I think you have to write well, you have to engage people, you have to be cognizant of the fact that people's communication patterns are changing and their user habits are changing, and so. I'd say, yeah, great. If you can make, a really engaging, fantastic, long-form report, do it. But don't assume that people will come and read your 4,000-word article unless you give them a reason to do it.
Got a question here from Rob Bowl on Twitter. please elaborate on your views of the role of public media as being an outlet for new media makers from all points of view.
Take that one, Jess.
Hi, Rob. I think that there's some real opportunities that public media has institutions both on the local level and on the national level to serve as an arbiter, as a hub for people who want to have serious discussions about issues, to make sure that the most vulnerable among us have the life-enhancing information that they need to, say, survive a blizzard or an economic crisis. We've seen a lot of real creative attempts to match content with outreach, especially around the economy, around H1N1. There's a flu portal that the public broadcasters just created so people can go and find reliable information about the flu if they're worried that they've caught it or they want to know about local outbreaks. I think the way that we think about public media has to change. It can't just be NPR and PBS any longer. It has to incorporate not just the new platforms, but new ways of communicating and creating context for people to come together around issues and to act as engaged citizens.
I think Jessica can handle that one.
So we have a question from Reclaim the Media. Does legitimacy just mean large audience?
No, actually, no, not at all.
No, legitimacy means no, because you can have a very small but influential audience. Your audience can be different policymakers in your community. And if you're reaching them and influencing sort of how they're deciding to make policy, then that's what you need. Or your audience is a community concerned about, media policy, Reclaim the Media, and they're able to help sort of drive information out into their own communities about sort of what's happening in media policy on a local and national level. That's influence. So it's really about what your users do with that information, which is why we keep harping on the idea of what's your impact, not just the size of your audience.
I think legitimacy comes partially through sourcing, partially through transparency, partially through branding. Again, public media has a very high trust factor, so there's a long history of attempts to really tell the whole story, and I think that authenticity is really important. Part of what we've seen in the shift of voice online is that people trust people who seem like they are telling them the truth. And that's part of why even The Daily Show and The Colbert Report have become legitimate news sources for a lot of people, is because the filter that they give of being cynical about both sides really kind of mirrors the way that a lot of people feel about the news right now.
And there's also a personality attached.
Yeah.
So.
Erin Polgren asks, beyond crowdsourcing, can you elaborate on effective creative reader engagement strategies? We're all familiar with TPM Cafe, but is there can you give us more examples or more specifics on that?
More specifics about how to, or
yes,
example?
How to. Example, I think she's looking for both.
So I think Firedog Lake has been a great example of sort of actually being a transparent and legitimate news source for a lot of organizations or users, and then actually helping drive them to action. The Uptake is a fabulous new video citizen journalism organization where they're based in Minnesota, but they work with a lot of different citizens around the country, training them to do video and capturing what's happening, and they're fabulous. So I would highly recommend looking at them. In terms of strategy for user engagement, I think first of all you need to know what you want your users to do. And be very clear about that. And then where are those users, how are they accessing information, and what are they doing with it? There's easy ways to find that out. And then maybe what are the users that you want to reach, or the networks or the communities you want to reach, and where are they at already if you're not there? That's some major first steps to start looking at.
At the Center for Social Media, futurepublicmedia.net, we've been doing a weekly Public Media 2.0 showcase that really examines different approaches to this question. One thing that we did a long-form case study on, which I was involved in and was really interesting, is called Twitter Vote Report. Mm-hmm. The idea there was to really go where people were. They were going to the polls. They had their phone in their pockets to try to do grassroots reporting on any problems at the polls, long waiting lines, people being asked for their ID. And so while most people were sort of sitting around drinking, watching the returns, I was doing what's called sweeping. I was cleaning up data all night long about moments of voting, and it was really cool. It was cool to be that directly involved in people's democratic experience, and it was also potentially a news breaking moment. It turns out there wasn't too much of a problem with the election, but there could have been, and that could have been right on the front lines.
So the Pulitzer Center has asked another question. They're very active, which thank you, Pulitzer Center. You must be watching. Implicit in this new, in your words, democratized media system, there's a lot more out there. Doesn't this, and I'm paraphrasing what they write, discourage audiences from consuming in-depth news?
Maybe. I think that people's news habits are changing. They're doing a lot more scanning. They're doing a lot more aggregating. But if the way that we talk about it at the center, and it's not that different from the way that Tracy and I talk about networks, is, there are particular publics who are interested in particular issues, and they really want to know more. They need to know more. For example, to take a sort of a nonpartisan angle, people who have diabetes. Okay, they need to know what's going on, what the research is, what treatments are available, what the controversies are, and they'll gravitate to that news and they'll go into depth with it because it's relevant to them. So I think it's kind of different than the mass model of assuming that everybody cares about everything. It's thinking more strategically about what matters to who and what they need to know.
Yeah, we live in an ADD society, and sometimes we need to figure out how do we create media for an ADD media almost, right? Like, I'm already, overwhelmed with all sort of the inputs I get. And there are moments in time when I can only handle, short blog posts or short articles. But there are moments where, especially if I'm particularly concerned about an issue or it's sort of pulling at I really like this music, I want to go learn more about it, that I'm going to go and sort of find that long-form journalism about it. So, I don't think, once again, it's not the death of long-form journalism. It's, once again, finding about who are the audiences that you want to reach with it and make sure you get it to them and that they can also find you and access you. Oh, there's questions in the audience. We have an audience.
Thank you. My name's Roberta Stanley. And one of the concerns some of us have who have journalism degrees and were trained in journalism. In fact, I was a reporter in the state capital of Michigan and broke that gender barrier back in the 70s.
Good for you.
And it's a lot better now than it used to be. So for you to complain now, I understand where you're coming from, but it was really awful then. You had to
imagine what we're still dealing with.
You had to have a backbone of steel.
Yeah, definitely.
But our journalism schools are falling by the wayside. University of Michigan did away with theirs. The one at Michigan State University, which has been accredited, which I'm a product of, and many of my friends, is undergoing some leadership shifts and challenges from the dean about production and money and so forth. And this is happening throughout the United States. I think a lot of us are concerned that there isn't proper training of some of the new journalism outlets or the people that serve in them. And if you could just respond to the training aspect and credibility that goes along with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think journalism schools are, as much as journalism organizations, are trying to figure out, what do we do? And unfortunately, I think there are some journalism schools that are far ahead of the pack than others. Jeff Jarvis at CUNY is doing an amazing job in not only he's sort of not how do you do journalism, but actually how do you create successful journalism business models, and working with students around that. I think more and more journalistic students need to know, not just the who, what, where, why, and when, but what does it take to support a successful media model or a media organization, because more often than not now, they may have to go out and do it on their own versus joining other other established media outlets, which is both exciting and scary, frankly. At the same time, I think we're seeing a lot of journalism organizations work with young journalists to actually experiment online and new ways of producing journalism, not just text-based. These two probably have a lot of experience talking about specific examples with this.
Yeah, part of what we're seeing is a growth in journalism and communication schools as incubators for new media projects, which really gives people hands-on experience in the new platforms. The Knight Commission report, which I would wave around, but it's in my backpack, identifies university-based journalism programs as a generative force for improving information needs of communities, for serving information needs of communities. Also, one of the things we've been taking a look at the Center for Social Media is the development of distributed online standards for reporting, for fair use, for impact assessment, for ethics. And so creating a kind of a... Well, they're being developed. Some of them are being developed at journalism schools. Some of them are being developed with existing professional journalism organizations. Some of them are being developed in unusual places, like on YouTube. There's a citizen reporting center on YouTube that kind of draws from those sources and provides training. So there's for retraining and for self-education, there's a new layer of resourcing that's happening.
Got a question?
In this new model that you've described, it's very of the people, very grassroots, as you've described it. Mm-hmm. Who should be responsible for news judgment in this new model? Could the digital mob, so to speak, push stories to the forefront that don't actually matter just because they're popular?
Well, yeah, that happens all the time. I mean, that's just the nature
like
of
Britney Spears?
our culture. Some people clearly care about Britney Spears, though. Whatever. So, yeah, it happens, but it's also about, I think, whether you want to call it a mob or a network, it's about how that media maker maybe not only taps into existing networks, but helps those networks form. And so, or if you want to help form your own mob, you may not be trying to work with the general public, right, around a lot of different your stories, but who are the audiences and users that you're going to tap into that will then help drive your story and your content and your issues out into the forefront. So
there's a lot of fear about this, but it's not like the existing journalism organizations are disappearing entirely. There's still there's an apparatus to generate traditional news that people can use as a reference point, and often do. A lot of the online discussion is really keyed to the news of the day, to the New York Times. A lot of the links that in that image that I showed of the sort of online ecosystem, a lot of links are going back to traditional and public news sources, and also to news sources that are closer to the origination of the content, research organizations, think tanks, what have you. So I think that, of course, there's always this sort of fear of the mob, but it's a little bit overblown, and people need to recognize that traditional journalists are using these platforms too, and that everybody's got a stake in it.
We've got one more question from Twitter. Could you give some more examples, especially of media outlets, that more of us should be looking to for good practices in this new world?
For good practices in this new world?
Yeah.
Well, some of the organizations we talk about in the book range from Talking Points Memo to the Young Turks, who...
I'm sorry to interrupt. That's actually women of color in media outlets?
Right.
Oh, women of color in media outlets. Oh, okay. That's different. So are we looking for women of color media outlets to look to?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. There's a great blog called Racialicious that's fabulous to look at. There's Jack and Jill Politics. I would recommend a high-quality, sort of more journalism, but also supporting different action, race lines, or the magazine color lines. So those are some examples of, I think, where you will see some great women of color reporters and media makers. through both the blogosphere and journalism organizations. Jess, do you have any others?
New American Media aggregates ethnic media from across the country, over 700 outlets, and so you can find all kinds of voices that you never hear on their website.
Okay. Jessica?
Yes, my question is, going back to that panel, one of the panels on your PowerPoint presentation, was it a cycle of engagement? Is that what you call it? Did you measure any time that takes, the cycle? Did you measure the life cycle?
Oh, no, we haven't measured it, but one of the things that we've discussed is that it involves new skill sets. So it assumes that you have staff that will help to do the outreach, to manage the conversations, to create context for engagement. And in the book, there's a graphic that Bill Densmore's group created about some of the new journalism roles that are emerging.
Well, I would say that a couple of things about that cycle of engagement thing. You don't necessarily have to have millions of staff. You can do it on your own. It just is a matter of how much time it, once again. And in that cycle, you don't have to do every single thing on that point. What's great about it is there's different points you can opt in that will have different results. So we really want to make sure it's clear that it's not a one-size-fits-all strategy. It's what fits best for your organization. And that cycle of engagement graphic was really about sort of showing all the different points that a media organization or media maker wants to consider when they want to start thinking about how to make high-impact media. So,
And that the time to do that could take anywhere from months to years, or
no, I mean I would
could take a day. It depends on your media production.
Yeah.
If your architecture is set up from the beginning to engage your users, then you're already doing it. You don't have to.
Yeah, it might take a while to sort of say you want to engage your users in story development or actually helping produce a story. Do you have that network already in place, or do you need to go out and build it? It may take some time to actually build that network, and then there's always the trial runs and the practices. But I mean, it doesn't have to take forever, and there should be both experimentation that goes along with it and having some fun too.
One more question from the audience.
So you've described professional or traditional journalism becoming more like citizen or public journalism, and vice versa. My question is, are the two going to remain distinct, or is it possible that they're going to meld entirely?
Well, they're going to be journalists that are paid and known as sort of professional journalists, and they're going to go through a lot of different training, go through the traditional journalism schools. I think, those professional journalists are going to be taking on a lot of sort of engagement strategies that we've been talking about that seem sort of new media-ish, but is sort of the foundation in terms of how they're going to need to produce their journalism. They also might be working with citizen journalists more in different ways. And then we will see sort of the rise of more sort of engaged citizen journalists or users that are producing news. I think there will always sort of be a distinct line, but I think it'll be blurred and more people will actually be working together and collaborating. At least that's what I'm hoping.
One of the interesting things about the history of public broadcasting is that it started out as a lot of disaggregated educational stations. And it didn't become kind of a collective entity until people decided that those practices needed to be elevated and supported. So I would anticipate that some of the more reliable, engaging, useful practices that are happening online will be incorporated into our public media as it evolves.
I have a question for you too. We're doing a lot of work here building on the Knight Commission report, Informing Communities in Sustaining Democracy in a Digital Age. We're really interested in the local and how this plays out at the local level.
Yeah.
I mean, how viable is your ideas at a small scale and tied into the local communities? And have you any examples?
I think a lot of the strategies that are laid out in this book can be applied to local and national media, political or non-ideological media. Some of the strategies, like fighting the right, may not be the local strategy or the strategy for a local organization, but how do you assemble or build a media network is something that could be. So how do you start working with other local organizations, local media makers? That's a strategy that can work. So I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this book for local media and journalists, and for even citizens and active people online who want to think about making media or connecting media together. So
I think that in some cases these strategies might be more powerful and effective on the local level, because one of the things that we've seen really moves people is when there's an interaction between face-to-face and online or broadcast consumption, when people can really see the other people who care about the issue that they're concerned with and talk to them. It's just much more meaningful to them, and it moves things along more quickly.
Any examples of the local level, or is there more work for us to do?
I think there's more work for us to do.
that's part 2
Yeah.
of the webcast.
Exactly.
Have we any questions from the audience? Any other? Yep. Right at the back.
Hi. I was just wondering if you talk in the book at all about sort of cross-ideology collaborations between news organizations. You talk about sort of like building networks, but it seems like a lot of the time that happens within sort of the left or the right. So whether you talk about the development of any sort of cross-ideology networks, and if that doesn't exist yet, whether you think it could or should.
Well, we don't necessarily talk about it in the book, but there is a recent example that just emerged in the last week called Demand Question Time, where different groups from Mother Jones and Firedog Lake, and then Instant Pundit on the right, and what's his name?
Mika?
No. The Grover Norquist, sorry. I was blanking maybe deliberately on his name. So have come together to, after Obama did his, did sort of the live webcast Q&A with the Republicans, and then a week later with the Democrats, all these sort of journalists from both the left and the right and different media producers have come together and started what they've called Demand Question Time, where they're demanding that the president and Congress do this more often, and live and web streamed and all that kind of stuff. So that's, I think, actually an amazing example where different ideological collaborations can happen for the better good of democracy, because they both care about that on both sides.
We do talk a little bit about the coalition that emerged around net neutrality in the book, and that's got implications for, it doesn't even have to be progressive or conservative. Everybody who wants to create media on the web and be accessible to their users should care about that. And I do think that some of the most powerful campaigns do cross ideological boundaries. I mean, part of what we're doing in this book is we're taking a very close look at a particular sector of ideological media, but it's not always the answer. And I spend half of my time thinking about this and half of my time really thinking about media that engages the entire populace, or that brings people who don't have access to issues, access to communication tools, into the conversation. I think we need all of these things. We're not going to be able to abolish partisanship. So the question is how to find ways to really productively debate some of the differences that we have, and to try to respect each other despite all of the sort of countervailing tendencies out there.
Well, folks, on that optimistic note, we'll wrap this up for today. Thank you very much for coming. If you braved it through the weather forecast and the snow that's probably going to meet you outside. And for those who listened and contributed online, we really appreciate your questions at this first inaugural event of the New America's Media Policy Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next time.